I'm going to launch my browser and then load up localhost. I don't have a server running, so I'm going to start one up right now and make sure it works. Now I'm going to set up a site directory. I'm going to call mine JQ plugin tutorial. I'm going to make sure I can access it in the browser, and then set up an index file. I'm going to quickly insert something so I'm not staring at a blank page. I'm going to open CodeKit to manage my client-side files. It's going to monitor my site directory and then automatically reload my browser as I edit files. I'm going to launch an editor so I can start modifying my files. I'm going to verify that as I edit files, they get updated in the browser. The plugin that I'm going to create is going to utilize the Google Maps API. The API is well documented. I'm looking for a sample file that I can start with. This sample file renders a map and draws a polygon. I grab the URL so that I can curl the contents of the page directly to my document. Quick cleanup and a save, and then I can see the sample file load on my development server. I'm going to make a few modifications, starting with the title of the document. And then I'm going to move all the script elements down to the bottom of the markup right before the closing HTML tag so that nothing gets blocked as the page renders. To further optimize, I'm going to set up a single JavaScript file. I'll call it main.js, and I'm going to put it in a scripts directory. I'll set that up right now. And I'm going to put in an alert just so I can see all the pieces connect. There we go. I set up CodeKit to periodically scan my directory for new files, but I'm just going to do a manual refresh now. Here's my JavaScript file when I load it directly in the browser. For further optimization, I want to make sure that this file gets minimized. CodeKit will do that for me on the fly as I edit the file, but since I haven't made a change, I'll just process it now. I'm going to take this path and then use it in my index file for the main script. I'm going to remove this alert message and start putting the real JavaScript in there. I'll start with this inline code. And move it over as is for now. You'll see the page is still working. I'm going to straighten up the formatting on the code. Now I'll concatenate this external script as well. I have a global reference to the library right here. I'm just going to note the name. And then I'm going to import that library into my main.js file. With the save, I can see that everything's still working. And here's what my file looks like with everything concatenated and minimized. Before moving on to the JavaScript, I want to modify the CSS a bit. I'm going to create a main.css file within a styles directory. Here's the direct URL to it once we get it created. I'm going to set up that styles directory. But instead of creating the CSS file directly, I'm going to use less to do it a little bit more efficiently. I've created a less directory, and inside here I'm going to create main.less. I'm going to note the ID to use for my selector. And I'm just going to put a hard-coded width and height in here for now. I'm going to manually refresh CodeKit so it can find my new less file. When I click process, it's going to generate my CSS file. I'm going to correct the path to where I want the file to be. And now I can see my basic CSS. I'm also going to correct the path of my index file. As well as correct my typo. And when I load up the index file again, I see the map and I see it with the dimensions that I want. Any valid CSS is also valid less, but I'm going to do something a little bit more specific to less. I'm going to set up a couple of variables. Actually, more than a couple. I'm setting up pixel values and some color values into these variables. Whoops, CodeKit's telling me I messed something up, and looks like I forgot semicolons here. Now I'm going to start putting these variables into action. I'm going to set up two format styles, one for a browser that just supports basic CSS, and then the other for a browser that supports CSS3. For CSS3 browsers, I'm going to do a thicker gray border with rounded corners. So beyond just setting up variables, I can also do some math functions with values using less. Here I want the total width and height to also consider the border width. So using the math functions, I'm able to do that really efficiently. Rounded corners will double as my width. And now when I crank up the value, it's still 500 by 500. And as I play around with the value, you'll see that my dimensions stay the same. Doesn't matter how big or small. As I mentioned, I was setting up two formats, one for a CSS3 compatible browser and one for just standard CSS. This is how I wanted the standard CSS browser to look. We're going to use a library called Modernizer to help us efficiently determine what is capable of the browser. Rather than use the full library as is, I'm going to do a custom build just to get the stuff that we need. I'm going to click to generate the code and then copy it over. I'll add it to the top of the main.js file. In the index file, I'm going to set up a class on the top HTML tag, and I'm going to set it to Node.js. Modernizer replaces the value of this class with the capabilities of the browser. Border radius is supported, and it's JS enabled. So now I can prefix a selector with the capability of the browser. That way, those browsers that don't support it still get the fallback formatting, but then the browsers that do support it get the new stuff. Just going to port over the base code and then modify the variables. In the browser, I can verify the fallback formatting just by invalidating the class up here. So let's get back to JavaScript. There are a couple more libraries that I'm dependent on to create the kind of plugin that I am. First is the jQuery library. I'm going to note the file name to my global reference here. And then I'm going to import it into my main.js file here. The next library is jQuery UI. Same thing, I'm going to note the file name here and then import it like this. After hitting save, CodeKit sees it and then recompiles for me. And then when I load main.js directly into my browser, I can see all the new code in there. Now the reason why I also imported jQuery UI is because we're using a component of that library called the Widget Factory. All plugins of the jQuery UI library are built using this Widget Factory. Since I'll be using it for my plugin, I'll be able to interact with it the same way I do with any other jQuery UI plugin. In fact, we'll start with the sample code for the dialog plugin as a basis for our code. To verify that all the pieces are in place, we're going to temporarily render out the dialog plugin in our own page. First, it requires this bit of markup here. Then it's going to require a bit of JavaScript to initialize. I'm going to write that initialization code within the document ready event. I don't use jQuery day to day, so I'm just going to quickly double check the syntax for it. Here we go. I'll just copy and paste it. I'll insert the example.js from the dialog example. I hit save. Now I'm giving CodeKit a second to recompile. And now I can verify it is rendered out in my page. So I'm going to clean up the markup, note the ID that I'm using, and then change dialog to map, which is going to be the name of my plugin. So when the browser refreshes, I'm going to see an error because I don't have it set up yet. I'm going to set up the file for my plugin. Inside the scripts directory, I'm going to have a file called map.mynamespace.js. Map is a generic name, so the namespace protects it. Before I forget, I'm going to add it to the list of files that I'm importing. I'm going to start out my JavaScript with a boilerplate. This one's specific to using the widget factory. I'm going to copy the URL so I can curl it to my file. Now I'm going to start the modifications, starting with updating the namespace and then the name. Just double checking that that's the name I wanted to use. And like before, I'm just going to use an alert message to see the pieces connect. CodeKit's compiling, and there's my alert. I'm going to take a second look at that example Google Maps code. And then I'm going to set up a private render function. This function will basically be the wrapper to all that initialization code. I'm going to copy it over as is for now. And after I hit save, let me just fix the formatting on this. I'm going to hit save again and give CodeKit a second to process the update. And when it does, I see that the map is still rendering as expected. Since we set up the document on ready event, we no longer need this onload. It's redundant. As well as that initialize function doesn't exist anymore. I'm going to change the coordinates for the map and the polygon. Here's a free geocoder that I'm going to use. I'm going to use the address of where I work. Plug that into the geocoder. And now I have a latitude and longitude of a place that's a little bit more relevant to myself. I'll insert those values here. I'm really zoomed out, so let me zoom in a bit. The code only uses this pointer variable once, so I'll set it directly. And I'll bump the zoom up to 17. I'm also going to change the map type to a hybrid. Now I'll work on getting that polygon to render within my new view. We don't need this last coordinate because the API will auto-close the polygon for us. I'm going to start moving some of these values into the main options object for the plugin. The coordinates option will store the string value of the coordinates. This pointer variable will split the values so I can have an array. And since I need more than just an array of two string values, I'll use parse integer to return some real numbers for me. If I didn't use parse integer, then those values would look like numbers, but they would actually be strings, like this. Center is going to be an option that's going to store the real lat-long value using the Google Maps API. I'm going to set up a couple more pointer variables, but before I do, let me change the naming convention a bit. I got an error because I forgot to change X to A here. This pointer variable will hold the map type ID for me. In the options object, I'm just going to set up a map type to store just a string value of the specific map type. Quick save. To recompile, and it still looks good. I'm going to start moving these options up to the top, starting with the coordinates. I'm going to set up center right after that, but I'm going to have to leave it null because I can't figure that out until runtime. Then we will move map type ID, which will also be null, but I can put in a string value for hybrid for the map type. Next is zoom, default to 17. For the creation of the map, I'll pass in directly the options object, and I'll get rid of my options. I don't need the pointer variable for map type anymore, so let me get rid of that. And I don't need the pointer for center, so I'll get rid of that too. I'll remove this line break right here. Quick save, recompile. And now I'm going to make the coordinates for this polygon a bit more dynamic. I suspect that I made a mistake up here with the parse integer. I believe I should have used parse float, but let me just log to the console what my values look like here. So yes, we have real numbers, but they're not the decimal ones we need. So I'll fix that up now. There we go, that's what I need. I'm going to change the name of the string value for coordinates to just chords. That way I can make coordinates a true array value that I will set at runtime. I'm going to add back in the b pointer variable to capture the coordinates value. That way I could set up the center with a lot less typing. I can replace this with this options.center. Next, I'm going to make these next two coordinates relative to my center position, like this. I'm going to put that relative amount up in my options as nudge. And I'll set up another pointer variable to save on typing. I'm going to get rid of this pointer variable since I'm not really plotting the Bermuda Triangle anymore. And now I'm going to make my array of coordinates a little bit more direct. I'm going to move all of these attributes for my polygon up into my options object. At this point, paths is going to be null, so I'm going to set it next to the other nulls. Then at runtime, I can give it a real value like this. So for the polygon, I'll just pass in the whole options object as well. Whoops, CodeKit's letting me know something's wrong. Oh yeah, I forgot to put a comma right here. Everything's still looking good. I'm going to convert this pointer variable to map to be a private property, which I need to remember to set to null in the destroy function. Another property that I'm going to set up is one that points to the node for this plugin. I should null that out in this destroy as well. I'm going to set up another private method, render controls, and in this method I'm going to render a control to destroy the map. There's a new way to render out DOM elements from jQuery, so I'm going to double check on the syntax for that. That's what I'm looking for. I'm going to paste this in and then modify it a bit. Let's set the ID to destroy. Remove the href and title and relative attribute and change the text to destroy. And I'm not going to append, rather I'm going to prepend to the body. And there we see it in the browser. I meant to make this a button, so let me change that now. I'll additionally set in the click handler so I can keep the correct scope sorted out. I'm going to set up a pointer variable self equal to this, and then I'll use it to apply a private method. Since my plugin is creating an element, I'm going to have the destroy method take it away. When I click the button in the browser, it duplicates, but what I want it to really do is destroy the map. Right now the destroy is only set up to take away the control, but now I'm going to set it up to also undo the map rendering. I'm going to set up a private property to note the original HTML of the node. And in actuality, I want the node to be a private property as well. I'm going to go ahead and set up a private property to capture the destroy. It should get nulled out as well. So after I remove the control, I'm also going to set the container or the node back to its original HTML. Which reminds me that that should also be nulled as well. Right now the original HTML is empty, so I'm going to put in some content. And then I'll give it a try. Perfect. Next, I'm going to set up an event that I can subscribe to. In the boilerplate there are two set up, but I just need one. And I'll set it up so we can subscribe to the drag event of the map. The event will basically dispatch the new center of the map. I'm going to double check with Google in the API for maps to see how I go about subscribing to a map event. Here's the event that I'm interested in. And this is the way I subscribe. I'll paste it in and modify it as needed. Like before, I'm going to set up a pointer variable to self equal to this to keep the scope sorted out. I'm going to change it to a private drag method. I'm going to get the console ready so I can see it in action. But before I could see it, I need to subscribe to the event. I'll set that up in the main.js file. And I'll do it by passing in a drag handler when I initialize the plugin. I'm just going to log into the console the second argument. Now, at the end of a drag event, I see my object logged to the console. Inside the object, I see center, which is the piece of information I'm interested in. I'm going to refine a little bit the exact information that gets dispatched. This will shield the plugin user a little bit more from the particulars of the Google API. Now the object contains centroid, which is just a simple array with longitude and latitude. As I play around with the drag event and look at the message printed to the console window, I can see the new center being broadcast. Next, I'm going to set up the plugin to react to a value change. That is, if the user changes one of the options, I can have the plugin react to that. I'll set up a conditional so anything that is not a declared option gets ignored. Next, I'm going to set up a case specifically for the change in the zoom value. If the plugin user changes the zoom value, I'm going to tell the map to set its zoom to whatever the value is that gets passed in. So back in the main file, below where I initialized the plugin, I'm going to pass in a new zoom value, set it to 1, and there you see it react. I'm going to set the value extra high this time. I'm going to play around with a couple more values here and see how the map reacts. I'm going to demonstrate another way that I like to pass in values, and that's by using a data attribute on the plugin's tag. I'll modify the plugin's create method to look for a data attribute to work with. Again, I'm going to use parse integer on the value because I need a real number, not a string. I got an error because I didn't put quotes around zoom. I'll just make it all one string for now. And now I can just as easily pass in a new zoom value through the data attribute. I'm going to play with a few different values here. Now I'm going to set up an abstract plugin that I can extend from. I'll just call it abstract, and I'll use the same namespace. For now, I'll just copy over what I have in map to my abstract. I'll remove all those options and change the name to abstract. I'm going to empty out the create method and get rid of the render and render controls methods. Clean up the destroy method. Get rid of the drag event method. And simplify the set option method. Just so I can see all the pieces connect, I'm going to set up a temporary private test method, and I'm going to put an alert message, alert123. I need to import this plugin, and I need to import it before the map plugin comes in. I can extend from this abstract by specifying it as the second attribute in the widget call. In the create method, I'm going to call that test method that I set up. And there, I see the pieces connect. I'm going to get rid of the abstracts create method and all the other functions that aren't needed. Really, we just need the one. I'm going to change the name of test to get data attributes. Then in map, I'm going to change the call to test to get data attributes and then move the code for getting the data attributes to the abstract. After a save and a refresh, things are still working the way I'm expecting. And I'm still able to mess around with the value from the data attribute. Now I'm going to modify the logic to work with more than just one. data attribute. Now I'll try modifying a different option. Now I'm able to modify the stroke weight in the same way. Now I'm going to try setting up fill opacity. It's not seeming to work the way I was expecting. And then I remember I have to use parse float instead of parse integer in my abstract. As I correct that, I'm going to grab a couple more options and set those up as data attributes. Map type is my first string-based attribute, and it initially doesn't work, and that's because I need to keep it as a string if the parse float fails, and now it works. And now I can very quickly modify options within data attributes and see my map react. I'm going to add another string-based option, the fill color for the polygon.